Welcome back, grade 11s. We are now going to do excretion, which is the removal of waste products from the body. Now this is quite a tricky section, so I'm going to do my best to walk you through the section step by step, but really this section, it's very helpful if you go onto YouTube and you have a look at some of the videos that talk about excretion. It's something that helps when you can see it visually. And so once you've gone through this section, please do yourself a favor, pop onto YouTube and have a look at some of the videos that show you the process. It might help and make it more understandable. So what is excretion? Excretion is the removal of waste products from the body. So most functions that your body has produces a waste product. Now that waste product would be damaging if it stayed in the body, and so excretion is the process by which those waste products are removed. The main excretory organs in the body are the skin. The skin produces sweat, which is a mixture of water, urea, and salt. Now urea is a nitrogenous waste, a waste made from nitrogen, and it is very toxic. The lungs are also an excretory organ. They remove carbon dioxide, which is the byproduct from cellular respiration. The kidneys remove uric acid, urea, ammonia, and water. And you'll notice that those things make up urine, so the kidneys produce urine, and you'll notice that the composition between urine and sweat are very similar, which is why sweat actually produces an odor when there is copious amounts of it. And then your large intestine or your alimentary canal, which removes heavy metals. We are going to focus on the urinary system. We're going to focus on the kidney and the excretion of uric acid, urea, water, and ammonia in the production of urine. So we're quickly going to look at the urinary system, and the main function of the urinary system is to maintain homeostasis, and remember homeostasis again, a balance, an internal balance, by regulating the composition, volume, and pressure of the blood. And it does this by producing urine, which has varying amounts of these different waste products. If we have a look at the urinary system, we can see that it is made up of a number of parts. First of all, there's a blood system going into the kidneys, which are these little bean-shaped organs over here, and the blood vessel that carries in oxygenated, unfiltered blood is our renal artery, and the blood vessel which takes out the deoxygenated but purified blood is the renal vein. We then have our kidney. We have two kidneys, left and a right. And on top of the kidney, you can see it over here, is the adrenal gland. We're going to talk about one of the roles of the adrenal gland a little bit later on. Coming out of the kidney is the ureter, and the ureter is a tube that carries the urine produced in the kidney to the bladder, which is the next component. The bladder is the temporary storage place of the urine, and then we have the urethra, which is where the urine is deposited outside of the body. It is important that you know those components. So we have the renal artery, the renal vein, the kidney, which produces urine, the ureter, which transports urine from the kidney to the bladder, which is the temporary storage site of urine, and the urethra, which carries the urine from the bladder to the exterior. You need to be able to identify and label the parts of this diagram. We are going to look in more detail now at the kidney, because that is the organ that we are going to be focusing on. And here is a diagram of the internal structure of the kidney. Now you will notice that the kidney is divided into three parts. We have the outer part over here, which is called the cortex. We have the middle part over here made up by these little triangles, which is called the medulla. And we have this part over here, which connects to the ureter, which is called the renal pelvis. Surrounding the outside of the kidney is the renal capsule, and it is a tough fibrous membrane which helps to protect the very, very sensitive organ that is the kidney. Our medulla is interesting. It's made up of these little triangles, and these little triangles are called the renal pyramids. And in between the renal pyramids over here, you can see we have the renal columns, and each little renal pyramid is connected to a little tube over here. Those tubes are called the calyx. So the little tube is called the minor calyx. It joins into the major calyx, and the major calyx is all joined up to the ureter. You can see here as well, here's the renal vein coming out of the kidney, and there's the renal artery going into the kidney. So you do need to be able to label an internal diagram of the kidney like this. And the kidney is the excretory organ which produces urine. Now inside the kidney we have millions of what we call nephrons, and we're going to look at the nephron in detail. The nephron is considered the functional unit of the kidney. So this is a diagram of the nephron, and you'll see that the nephron is made up of a number of different parts. It consists of two main portions, and we're going to look at each little portion and what it does. First of all, this line over here indicates the junction between the cortex and the medulla. So this part here we find in the cortex. Remember that top part of the kidney that we just looked at. And then this bottom bit over here is found in the medulla. So you need to bear that in mind when you are talking about it. So top part, cortex, bottom part, medulla of the kidney. What are the two portions that the nephron is divided into? We have what is called the renal corpuscle, or another name for the renal corpuscle is the Malpigian Body. And that's this little guy over here, this ball-shaped thing over there. That is the renal corpuscle. And then the second part of the nephron is the renal tubules, which is all of this over here is considered the renal tubules. Okay, so now we are going to go into detail on each little part of the nephron. I like to break the nephron up into 4 parts. Part number 1, the Malpigian Body. Part number 2, this first little set of tubules over here, which is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Then this long tube down here, which is called the loop of Henle. These little tubes over here, the distal convoluted tubules, and then lastly, this last tube over here called the collecting duct. So we're going to look at each of those, I think I said 4, it's 5 sections, and what they do and how they provide a function in the production of urine. We are going to start with the Malpigian Body. So the Malpigian Body, number 1, is found in the cortex of the kidney. Number 2, it is made up of 2 parts, the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. Now the glomerulus is a ball of capillaries. So this here, these capillaries over here, that is the glomerulus, and being capillaries, it carries blood. So the renal artery comes into the kidney, it splits up into a whole bunch of arterioles, and those arterioles form a ball of capillaries called the glomerulus. And then we have the Bowman's capsule. The Bowman's capsule is a capsule that the glomerulus sits in. So here is the Bowman's capsule. And the main function of the Malpigian Body is ultrafiltration. We do talk about each of these things again later on, but it's important to know the Malpigian Body found in the cortex of the kidney. It is made up of the glomerulus, which is a ball of capillaries, and the Bowman's capsule, which houses that ball of capillaries, and its main function is ultrafiltration. Filtration, filtering, if you think of filtering through a sieve, the big stuff stays behind, the small liquid components move through, and ultra just means really, really, really good filtration. Then we have the renal tubules and the ducts, and those are divided into 3 parts. Remember the proximal convoluted tubules, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubules. We are going to look at each of these as individual components. So it might be a little bit confusing in the beginning, but hopefully by the end of the section, you'll be able to put it all together to form a nice picture that makes so much sense. So the distal convoluted tubules of a number of nephrons empty into a single collecting duct. So if you have a look here, here's the collecting duct. It's the last little bit of the nephron. And we have the distal convoluted tubules, which is the last part of the little nephron. And they empty out the urine into a collecting duct. And you'll see that one collecting duct houses more than one nephron. The collecting ducts unite to form a papillary duct, which drains into the calyces and eventually into the renal pulvises. Now we're going to look at the nephron blood supply. The renal artery enters the kidney and branches into smaller arterioles. The afferent arteriole divides into smaller capillaries to form the glomerulus. So remember we said the glomerulus was a ball of capillaries. The little vessel that brings the blood into that ball of capillaries is called the afferent arteriole. The capillaries of the glomerulus reunite to form the efferent arteriole. The words are very similar, but please make sure that you are clear that the afferent arteriole brings the blood into the glomerulus, the efferent arteriole brings the blood from the glomerulus. If you think E and exit, that sometimes helps. Efferent exits the glomerulus. The efferent arteriole, once it's left, so here it is over here, so the afferent arteriole brings the blood into the glomerulus. It does its ultrafiltration business, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, and then that blood then leaves via the efferent arteriole. You can see it there if you follow my laser pointer. The efferent arteriole then branches into a network of capillaries which runs around the rest of the tubules of the nephron. And then these vessels eventually reunite back to form the renal vein. So the blood comes into the renal artery, it branches into a number of different arterioles. Some of those arterioles, called the afferent arterioles, bring the blood into the glomerulus. Ultrafiltration happens. The efferent arteriole takes the blood out of the glomerulus, branches into a network of capillaries, which kind of wraps itself around the rest of the tubules of the nephron, and then once it's all done, reunites back to the renal vein, which then takes the blood out and back into the circulatory system. So now we're going to look at the functioning of the kidney. The function of the kidney, the main function, is the excretion of nitrogenous wastes in the form of urine. It is also responsible for osmoregulation. Now, osmoregulation, osmo means water, regulation, to regulate. It is responsible for controlling the water content in our body, specifically in our blood. It also helps to regulate the blood pH. That is whether the blood is acidic or alkaline. Now, human beings, our blood should be at a neutral level, around 7.4 pH, and our kidneys are responsible for helping to increase or decrease that pH if it goes out of balance. And the kidney is also responsible for salt regulation. And it's important that the salt levels in our blood is regulated because it impacts our blood pressure. Too much salt, high blood pressure. Too little salt, low blood pressure. The right amount of salt, correct blood pressure. So now we are going to look at each little part. We are going to start with glomerular filtration or ultrafiltration. And remember, this occurs in the Malpigian Body or the Renal Corpuscle, which is found in the cortex. Now, we spoke about this already. The blood comes into the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole and it exits the glomerulus in the efferent arteriole. The glomerulus is a ball of capillaries, and you should remember about capillaries made up of squamous epithelial cells, very thin cells, allows for rapid diffusion of substances, etc. And that glomerulus is housed within this Bowman's capsule, and together it forms the Malpigian Body. And its job is ultrafiltration. So the blood that comes into the glomerulus contains, what does it contain? Remember, it's come from the renal artery, so it contains oxygen, nutrients, and waste. So it contains all the useful substances that blood needs, like water, iron, salt, glucose, amino acids, all the good stuff. It contains all the waste substances, like urea, uric acid, creatinine, and it contains your normal blood constituents, because it is blood. So red blood cells, white blood cells, blood proteins, and plasma. The blood, as it enters in through the afferent arteriole in the glomerulus, it's under a very high pressure. Now, the reason why there is a high pressure in the glomerulus is because the opening of the afferent arteriole is wider than the opening of the efferent arteriole. Again, I like to say the A is nice and fat, so it's wider Okay, the E is a skinnier letter, the opening is narrower. And this puts the glomerulus under pressure. I want you to think about a hose pipe. You have a hose pipe, you turn it on, the water's coming out. The water comes out at a fairly low pressure. But what happens when you squeeze the hose pipe tight and you close that lumen, you make it narrower? It puts the water under pressure and it starts to spray out. Essentially, that is what is happening here. Blood is coming in through a large opening and being forced to exit through a small opening, which puts that glomerulus then under pressure. The glomerulus is also porous, so those blood capillaries, remember when we did the lymphatic system, we learned that blood capillaries are porous. When it is under pressure, all the blood plasma that is found in that ball of capillaries, because it's now under pressure, gets squeezed out of the blood. So the increased pressure forces out both the useful and the waste products out of the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule through that blood plasma. So the glomerulus under pressure squeezes out all that blood plasma, which contains the good substances, your glucose, your amino acids, your ions, your everything, as well as all the waste products, your urea, your uric acid, and all of that gets squeezed out and gets caught by the Bowman's capsule. Now, as that blood plasma squeezes out into the Bowman's capsule, we no longer call it blood plasma because it's not in the blood anymore. We call it glomerular filtrate. Okay. So the tiny pores of the capillaries and the specialized cells of the Bowman's capsule, called the podocytes, together form an ultrafilter which selectively allows certain substances to pass through. So our blood capillaries here are porous, but those pores are a certain size, so they're only going to allow certain things to pass through. And it passes through into the Bowman's capsule over here, and lining the Bowman's capsule, this inner lining of the Bowman's capsule, has very specialized cells called podocytes, which you need to know. And podocytes are thin cells which have these things called slit pores, which allows substances to enter through those little slit pores. And what are the substances that are allowed to pass through? Water, glucose, amino acid, uric acid, and urea. What are the substances that don't get to pass through because they're too big? They don't fit through the pores of the blood vessels themselves. The blood cells and the blood proteins. So your blood cells, your red blood cells, your white blood cells, your blood proteins, they all stay in the blood capillaries and they leave via the efferent arteriole. But the liquid component, the water, the urea, the amino acids, the ions, they all pass from the blood capillaries in the glomerulus through the podocytes into the open space in the Bowman's capsule. This fluid is called glomerular filtrate, and then it moves from the Bowman's capsule into the first set of renal tubules. Okay, so that is the process of ultrafiltration, getting the substances from the blood into the renal tubules through the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. How is the Malpigian body well adapted to ultrafiltration? How does it work? First of all, we are going to look at how is the glomerulus adapted for ultrafiltration. The glomerulus is adapted because the afferent arteriole is wider than the efferent arteriole, which puts the glomerulus under pressure, which forces that filtrate out. The Bowman's capsule is adapted because, there's one more in the glomerulus. And also in the glomerulus, the capillaries are porous, which allows that filtrate to actually leave quite easily. In the Bowman's capsule, we see that the Bowman's capsule is cup-shaped to increase the surface area for the collection of the glomerulus filtrate. We want to collect all that filtrate, so a nice big surface area helps us to do that. And the podocytes have slit pores, which allows the filtrates to enter into the Bowman's capsule nice and easy. If you look at these diagrams on the side here, you can see the filtrate moving from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. And then there's a nice close-up there. So what do you need to know? Malpigian body, found in the cortex. Its job is ultrafiltration. What is ultrafiltration? It's the removing of the filtrate from the blood in the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. What does that filtrate contain? That filtrate contains all the good substances carried in blood, amino acid, glucose, ions, water, and it contains all the waste products carried in blood, urea, uric acid, creatinine. And then we need to know how is it adapted for its function. Glomerulus, afferent arteriole, wider than the efferent arteriole, which puts the glomerulus under pressure, forcing that filtrate out. And the capillaries are porous, which allows that filtrate to move out quite easily. The Bowman's capsule, it is cup-shaped to increase the surface area, and it has slit pores, which allows that filtrate to move in. So that is step number 1, ultrafiltration. Now, before we move on to the rest of our nephron, we need to learn some helpful terminology. Now, in biology, it is a science and it has a specific jargon, a specific set of words that mean things. And it is important that you know what these words mean as we move through. So if you take some time here to learn these words, they will be really helpful when we start throwing them out in the next couple of sections. So the first one is, what is filtration? Filtration means that substances have moved from the blood to the lumen or the opening in the Bowman's capsule. Then reabsorption. Reabsorption means from the lumen or from the tubules of the nephron to the blood. So if we say something is reabsorbed, we say it's moving from the tubules to the blood. Secretion, if we say secretion, it means it's moving from the blood to the tubules. So from the blood to the tubules. And if we say the word excretion, we mean that it's going from the lumen to the external environment, or from the tubules to the external environment. So those words are very important. Filtration, from blood to lumen. Reabsorption, from lumen to blood. Secretion, from blood to lumen. And excretion, the lumen to the external environment. And the lumen that we're talking about are these renal tubules. Okay, the next little bit that we're going to look at is tubule reabsorption. Now this happens in the proximal tubule, so the first little section of the tubule after the Malpigian body, and here reabsorption of the good substances. Remember that filtrate that came out contained all the good stuff as well as the bad stuff. We're talking excretion, so we're talking the removal of waste products. So the only thing we want to urinate out are our waste products. We don't want to urinate out our good stuff because we need that for our body's functioning. So we need to take that good stuff back up into the blood, and this happens during tubular reabsorption, which happens in the proximal tubule. Now the proximal tubule is also found in the cortex of the kidney, and it consists of a single layer of cuboidal epithelium cells. Cuboidal, they're little square cells, and they have a brush border of microvilli and numerous mitochondria. First thing you need to remember with microvilli is its job is to increase the surface area, in this case for absorption. And what is the role of a mitochondrion? Mitochondria undergo cellular respiration to provide energy, and these cells have lots of mitochondria to produce lots of energy for the active reabsorption of all these good substances. So in tubular reabsorption, all the useful products, glucose, amino acids, some ions, etc., except for water, are actively reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. The filtrate, which now contains only water and the waste products, pass on to the next step, which is the loop of Henle. So once again, here we have our glomerulus. It has undergone ultrafiltration, and we have the filtrate now in the Bowman's capsule. It then moves into the first set of convoluted tubules called the proximal tubules, where tubular reabsorption takes place. What is reabsorption? It is when all the good products get reabsorbed from the filtrate. So your ions, your glucose, and your amino acids are reabsorbed by this proximal convoluted tubule. And how is the proximal convoluted tubule adapted for reabsorption? It has microvilli to increase the surface area for maximum reabsorption, and it has mitochondria to produce the energy needed for active reabsorption. So if we just follow the pattern of the filtrate for a second, in the Bowman's capsule in the very start of the nephron, we had water, good products, and bad products. After reabsorption, before it enters into the next section, which is our loop of Henle, Our filtrate now only has water and waste products because all the good products have been reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule. Our next section is the loop of Henle, and another word or another name to call it is the sodium pump. Now sodium is salt, remember salt, normal table salt, NaCl, okay? Sodium pump, and the function of the loop of Henle is to ensure that the medulla has a high concentration of sodium ions in order to lower its water potential. Remember, we spoke about water potential last year. The more solute you have, the lower the water potential, and according to osmosis, water wants to move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So the point of the loop of Henle is to make sure that the medulla, which is where we find the loop of Henle, is very salty. It has a very low water potential. This will set up the kidney for osmoregulation later on. It will cause water to move from a high concentration inside the tubule where there's filtrate to the medulla where there is a low water potential, and then from the medulla back into the blood vessels. So the function of the loop of Henle is to ensure that the medulla has a high concentration of sodium ions, which means a low water potential, when compared to the tubular fluid to ensure maximum removal of water from the tubular fluid. Sodium ions move passively into the tubular fluid along the descending limb, whilst water moves out of the descending limb via osmosis. So what happens here is your loop of Henle is divided into two limbs, descending and ascending. Everybody happy? The descending limb is permeable to water, but impermeable to solutes. So here, water can move out via osmosis nice and easy. The ascending limb, water cannot move out. It's impermeable to water, but it is highly permeable to sodium and chloride. So what happens is the ascending limb pumps sodium and chloride out from the filtrate, because remember it's filled with ions. So it pumps sodium and chloride out into the medulla, makes the medulla nice and salty, lowers the water potential. Then any water that is in the descending limb simply moves out of the filtrate via osmosis. In order to facilitate the reabsorption of the remaining water, sodium ions are actively pumped out of the ascending limb into the tissue fluid of the medulla. This ensures that the water potential of the tubular fluid is raised and water does not leave the ascending limbs as its walls are impermeable to water. So it's important here that you know that the whole process of this, or whole purpose of this, is to move water from the filtrate out into the medulla. How is that done? The ascending limb pumps out salt, which makes the medulla of the kidney nice and salty, has a low water potential, which allows water to move passively via osmosis out of the descending limb from the filtrate. In the distal and the tubule and the collecting ducts, water is reabsorbed by osmosis out of the tubules and back into the medulla and finally back into the blood. So this process, water doesn't only move out of the descending limb of the loop of Henle, but if necessary, it can still move out of the distal tubules and the collecting duct. Any fluid remaining in the tubules after the loop of Henle is now regarded as urine. So it's filtrate all the way until after the loop of Henle, and then it is considered urine, because now what is remaining is the excess water that the body doesn't need and the waste products. And we'll talk a little bit more about the refining of osmoregulation using the hormone ADH in more detail later on, but it helps to control how much water leaves the kidney. So we have done in our nephron, here's our nephron, we have spoken about step number 1, ultrafiltration, which happens in the Malpigian body. We've then spoken about our reabsorption of our reabsorption of our good products in our proximal tubule. We've spoken about the sodium pump and water moving out in the loop of Henle. We're now going to talk about what happens in the distal convoluted tubule. And what happens here in the distal convoluted tubule is tubular excretion. It's the fine tweaking of the filtrate or the urine to make sure that we get everything that we need back into the body from the urine before it is released as a waste product. So tubular excretion is the movement of substances from the blood into the tubular fluid, and some substances that are actively excreted here are hydrogen ions, potassium ions, ammonium ions, and certain drugs. The excretion of substances into the tubular fluid is an active process, which means it requires energy. One of the main functions of tubular excretion is the regulation of the pH of the blood. And this is important. So we are going to look at this slide over here. We can see the pH of the blood is regulated by the amount of hydrogen ions. So hydrogen ions make something acidic. So if you have lots of hydrogen ions in a substance, it's going to be highly acidic. If you have a few hydrogen ions in a substance, it's going to be mildly acidic. In contrast to that, bicarbonate ions make something alkaline. So a few bicarbonate ions make something a little bit alkaline. Lots of bicarbonate ions make something very alkaline. So what happens here in the pH balance is the exchange of hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions between the blood and the renal tubules to make sure that our blood stays at the correct pH. So if the blood becomes too acidic, there's too many hydrogen ions in our blood, then the tubules will extract those hydrogen ions from the blood, so hydrogen ions will move from the blood to the renal tubules. If the blood becomes too alkaline, then more bicarbonate ions are extracted from the blood. So if it becomes too alkaline, then bicarbonate ions move from the blood capillaries into the renal tubules. So it's the last final tweaking that happens in terms of our tubular excretion at the distal proximal tubule. These distal tubules are found in the cortex of the kidney. So Malpigian body, cortex. Proximal tubule, cortex. Loop of Henle is found in the medulla. Distal tubule, cortex. And then we need to talk about the role of ADH in osmoregulation. So a large proportion of the water is removed from the filtrate in the loop of Henle. But again, right at the end, we have some final tweaking of the water amounts. And this is controlled by a hormone called ADH. It's anti-diuretic hormone, but lucky for you, you only need to know it as ADH. And this hormone controls the amount of water reabsorbed by the blood. Remember, when we say reabsorbed, it means that water is going to move from the renal tubules back into the blood. It is produced by the hypothalamus, which is a region in your brain, and it's stored in the pituitary gland, and it's released into the blood by the pituitary gland. That is important. Now, these next two passages, you need to learn these passages word for word, off by heart. The ADH control of water content is a guaranteed question that is going to come up in any exam that you write, and it is important that you know what ADH does. So it looks long and boring, but I promise you it is very important. You need to know it. So after all of this, we're now at the distal tubule. So ultrafiltration has happened, reabsorption has happened, the loop of Henle has happened, tubular excretion has happened. Now we're at the last step. There's going to be a quick check by your body about the amount of water in your blood. If the water content of the blood is still too low, let's say it's been a really hot day, you've sweated a lot, so a lot of water has left your blood through sweat, or you haven't drunk enough water that day, so you haven't had anything to drink all day, and so your blood water level is low. Osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are stimulated. A message is sent to the pituitary gland, which releases more ADH. So low water content in the blood, more ADH is going to be produced by your pituitary gland. What ADH does is it increases the permeability of the walls of your distal tubule and collecting ducts. So usually those walls are quite impermeable to water because the only time you really want to lose water is through the loop of Henle. So most of the time those walls are impermeable and the urine gets passed through them. But if the water content in your blood is low, then more ADH is going to be produced. And what ADH does is it makes the walls of the distal tubule and the collecting duct more permeable to water. This means that water can now leave those tubes. Remember, your medulla is nice and salty, so it's primed for osmosis out of the filtrate where there's lots of water back into the medulla, which is then collected by the blood. So if your water content in your blood is low, more ADH is released, which makes the walls of the distal tubule and collecting ducts more permeable to water. So more water will leave the tubules via osmosis and enter the blood capillaries in the medulla. So the water content in the blood will increase, but the water content in your urine will decrease. So in that filtrate, water is removed, it will be decreased, which means that the amount of urine you produce is less and it will be more concentrated, it will be a darker color. You'll possibly have noticed that on a hot day, you need to go to the bathroom less often, and when you do go, it's bright yellow. That is because you have reabsorbed more water from your urine into your blood. Okay, so I'm going to go through that one more time. Again, you need to know this passage. So if the water content in your blood is low, and how do we get low water content in our blood? It's a hot day, you've sweated a lot, or you haven't drunk any water. Then the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus will be stimulated. A message will be sent to the pituitary gland, which will release more ADH into the blood. ADH increases the permeabilities of the walls in the distal tubule and the collecting ducts. More water will then leave the tubules via osmosis to be reabsorbed by the blood vessels in the medulla, and your urine that is produced will be less and more concentrated. Obviously, we have to look at the opposite as well. So when the water content of the blood is high, you've had lots to drink, it's a cold day, you haven't sweated, osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are stimulated, and a message is sent to the pituitary gland to release less ADH. Because there's now less ADH, the walls of the distal tubule and the collecting ducts are less permeable to water. Less water leaves the tubules via osmosis, and you produce large amounts or copious amounts of dilute urine. Okay, here's just a little summary. Again, please make sure you know this. So when the blood water content is low, more ADH is going to be released, the tubules will become more permeable, more water will be reabsorbed in the blood, more concentrated urine will be produced. When the blood content in the when the water content in the blood is high, less ADH is released, the walls will be less permeable, less water will be reabsorbed into the blood, more urine that is more dilute will be produced. This is possibly one of the most important things that you need to know about this section. We're now going to look at the role of aldosterone. Remember, we said that the kidney's job was also to regulate salt intake. This is where aldosterone comes into play, and aldosterone is a hormone produced by the adrenal glands, those little glands that sit on top of the kidneys. The adrenal glands also produce adrenaline, but adrenaline has got to do more with the central nervous system than with excretion, but it also produces aldosterone. Now, if the blood has a low salt amount, so what happens here is you've eaten too little salt or you've sweated, because remember you lose salt in sweat, then the adrenal glands will release the hormone aldosterone, which promotes the absorption of salt from the tubules into the blood. So if your salt level is low, so your blood pressure is nice and low because there's no salt in your blood, then aldosterone is produced by the adrenal glands, which makes the blood reabsorb salt ions from the filtrate in your kidneys. If the alternate happens, so you've eaten a packet of salt and vinegar chips, you have lots and lots of salt in your blood, then no aldosterone will be produced, and all that salt will leave your body in the urine. Right, so now we've gone through how filtration works, from the Malpigian body, ultrafiltration, to the proximal tubule reabsorption, to the loop of Henle osmoregulation, to the distal tubule tubular excretion, to the collecting duct and ADH, tweaking the amount of water that is produced. So that is the whole excretion process in producing urine. So what are the structural suitabilities of the kidney to carry out its function? Its function of osmoregulation, excretion, salt control, and pH control. First one is the afferent arteriole is wider than the efferent arteriole, which increases the pressure in the glomerulus, which facilitates filtration. We spoke about that in detail. The podocytes of the Bowman's capsule have slit pores, and the capillaries of the glomerulus are porous, which forms an effective filtration membrane because the substances are actually able to pass through those barriers. The cup-shaped Bowman capsule allows for close fitting of the glomerulus and a greater surface area for filtration. The cells of the tubules have a brush border of microvilli to increase the surface area for selective reabsorption in the proximal tubule. The renal tubule is long and convoluted, which just means folded, allowing sufficient time for tubular reabsorption and excretion. We need time to get all those levels right, and so the convolutions, the folding increases the surface area. And a large number of mitochondria are present in the cells of the proximal tubule, which produces energy to allow for reabsorption. So it's very well adapted for its job. Again, with all these sections, there are YouTube clips that show you visually what is happening. Again, I would suggest going to watch them. It's just helpful to have a more visual picture. Okay, we're quickly going to run through some of the diseases of the kidneys. First one is kidney stones. These form because of salts that are present in the urine, and sometimes they clump together, and the crystals grow over time and cause a blockage in the ureters. So you can see here, blockage in the ureter. Now this is very, very painful. If you think about it, some people will say it's similar to childbirth because the pain of childbirth is something big trying to fit through something small. Same here. The kidney stones can get quite big and they're trying to fit through this tiny little tube through the ureter, and it's very, very painful. So you can either get it removed surgically, or what they sometimes do is they'll put a laser in and break it up into smaller pieces and then allow it to pass out. To reduce the risk of kidney stones, make sure you drink at least 8 glasses of water a day. The more hydrated you are, the less likely you are to have kidney stones. Another disease is kidney infection. Kidney infection is more common in women. Because women have a shorter urethra, it's easier for bacteria to get into the bladder, from the bladder up the ureter into the kidney. Bacteria starts in the bladder and spreads throughout the urinary system. It can be treated with antibiotics, and obviously our kidneys are a vital organ. If they aren't functioning properly, it can be fatal. So it is quite a serious thing when you get a kidney infection, and the symptoms can include a high temperature, back and side pain, frequent urination, pain when urinating, or blood or pus in the urine. So if you have any of those symptoms, go to the doctor. Bilharzia can also affect your kidneys. Bilharzia is a disease caused by a parasitic worm called a fluke, which lives in infected water. It enters the body through cuts in the skin, and once you have bilharzia, the worms actually live in the blood vessels around your intestines and your bladder. So they live in the blood vessels surrounding your bladder, and sometimes they can move up into the kidneys and cause kidney infection. Symptoms include blood in your urine. And then, of course, we have kidney failure. Kidney failure results when kidneys fail to remove water, salt, and nitrogenous wastes from the blood. Kidney failure is fatal. Because your kidneys are considered to be a vital organ, if they're not working properly, they can cause you to die. And when you are in renal failure or kidney failure, you have two options. The one is a kidney transplant. That is, of course, a permanent solution to the problem. However, transplants are very difficult because you have to find an exact match for your tissue and blood type, and those aren't very common. So if you can't get a kidney transplant, you can be kept alive by something called dialysis. And there are two types of dialysis. The first one is hemodialysis. This involves the use of a dialysis machine. And the patient's blood from an artery in the hand is connected to the dialysis machine, and the machine actually acts like a kidney. It does all the things that the kidney does. It removes the waste, it regulates the water, it regulates the pH, it regulates the salt. And then the clean blood is then brought back into your body. So with hemodialysis, if you look here, your blood actually leaves your body. So it takes your blood from your body out through a machine. It does all the work that the kidney would do, and then that clean blood is put back into your body. And then there is another type of dialysis called peritoneal dialysis, which involves the passing of the dialysis solution into the patient's abdominal cavity. So in hemodialysis, your blood is taken from your body, run through a machine and put back into your body. Here, your blood stays in your body and they run the fluid through your abdominal cavity. It takes about 4 to 6 hours, and during the procedure, the nitrogenous wastes and other impurities diffuse from your blood into the dialysis fluid. The dialysis fluid is then removed from the patient's abdominal cavity, and this type of dialysis is helpful because it can be done at home. If you are having hemodialysis, you have to go to the hospital where there's a dialysis machine, whereas this can be done at home. So here you can see what happens is the fluid is actually passed through your abdominal cavity, all the diffusion happens, and then it moves out into a drainage bag. And our last little bit for excretion is the advantages and disadvantages of kidney transplants versus dialysis. The kidney transplant, it's a once-off procedure. It's very expensive, but you only pay one sum of money. It can lead to organ rejection, and if this happens, you need to find another kidney or go back onto dialysis. The patient is not required to live near a hospital because once the operation is done, they have a fully functional kidney. We can move back into the real world. It might be difficult finding a donor, and some religious beliefs prevent organ donation. So if you are of that particular religion, you wouldn't be able to get the transplant even if they found a match. With dialysis, it happens either every day or a few days a week. It's relatively inexpensive, but it's ongoing, so you have to pay for the rest of your life, which then builds up to quite a large amount. You had no risk of rejection. The procedure is time consuming, and the patient must live near a hospital. And if you're on dialysis, it's quite hard to maintain a regular job because every day or every few days you have to go sit in the hospital for 4 to 6 hours, which makes it quite hard to work. No donor is necessary, and there's no religion that prevents dialysis. So, to recap, excretion. It is the removal of waste products from the body, and we look specifically at the formation of urine, looking at the kidney and the functional unit of the kidney, which is the nephron. So remember, with the nephron, you need to be able to identify every part: Malpigian body, proximal tubule, loop of Henle, distal tubule, collecting duct, and you need to know what happens at each part. Malpigian body, ultrafiltration. Proximal tubule, reabsorption of good substances. Loop of Henle, osmoregulation. Distal tubule, tubule excretion, particularly our pH balance and our salt control. Collecting duct, that is where you form the urine and it is removed from your body. And at that end point, we have the next set of osmoregulation involving ADH. And remember, you have to know the conditions and the response of ADH per circumstance, whether your blood water is low or whether your blood water content is high. So that is excretion. I know it is a technical and quite a tricky section, but if you move through this video slowly, you watch some YouTube videos, you should be able to get a grasp on it.